So I am honored to welcome the Science and Innovation Advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, Vytas Jankauskas. Please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Sir Jeremy Farrar, who is a globally recognized scientist and a leader in global health. Sir Jeremy Farrar is a medical researcher whose work on infectious diseases has shaped international relations, international responses, international preparedness to major health threats, health emergencies. Colleagues, just to let you know, Jeremy Farrar has published 600 articles. Okay, I published 10 articles. So I made a calculation that I need to write another 590 papers to reach Jeremy's level, which is a lot of work. And so it is even more of a privilege to have Jeremy Farrar here. He has served for 10 years as director of the Wellcome Trust and now holds the position of Assistant Director General for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention and Control at the World Health Organization, where he previously served as chief scientist. Throughout his career, Jeremy Farrar has been at the forefront of epidemic preparedness and response, also advising governments and international institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the pandemic, as we all know, was a major shock. In many countries, it led to the creation of new science advisory mechanisms. In my home country, for instance, Lithuania, it led to the creation of a governmental science advisory network. So now in each ministry, we have a science advisor, also in the government office, with a PhD and an academic background to help policymakers understand what's going on. Sir Jeremy will talk about science in a fragmented world, about the lessons from the pandemic for science diplomacy. And we have many questions open, as we see yesterday, as we saw today. What is science diplomacy? Do we actually have the same in mind when we speak about it? Where are its boundaries? Interestingly, did countries which had strong science advisory mechanisms and diplomatic measures respond better to the COVID-19 than others? What are the ethical dilemmas? Do we even know all of them? Have we identified all of them? So there is lots to learn, and that is what makes this topic, I guess, so exciting, but such a difficult task for Sir Jeremy Farrar to shed light on these questions. However, due to his immense expertise, I'm sure that we will learn a lot in the next couple of minutes. So, this being said, please welcome to the stage Sir Jeremy Farrar.
Thanks very much indeed. Three things. One is I must update this photograph because that wasn't yesterday. And secondly, I'm not a great believer in volume over quality. So 10 may be far better than whatever the other number was. And thirdly, congratulations on setting up scientific advice in every ministry. Because I think that is absolutely essential. And if there was one takeaway, maybe from the conference and from my comments now, we desperately need scientifically literate policymakers. But we also need policy literate scientists. And unless we bridge those gaps, and if the scientific community thinks that politics and policymaking is not for them, then we collectively can't really complain when policy isn't necessarily following scientific evidence. So, and I obviously have a personal bias, having been a scientist in Vietnam for almost 20 years, and then at Wellcome and now at WHO. It's not a failure of a scientific career to go into scientific policy. And maybe that's an important lesson as well. In fact, I might argue it's absolutely essential. So thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a couple of minutes I have, is it? It's 2 minutes to talk, or slightly longer? 20, oh God. It's between the... Anyway. So, and apologies for those who might have been in the panel earlier, because I will have to repeat a couple of things I said, but there's a lot more people here in the room now. Firstly, I think we are going through a really important moment in history. When consensus and agreement, largely over the last many, many decades, whilst not universal, has been a common theme across different countries, different political systems, different societies, different cultures. And I think at the moment, and not just this year, it goes back prior to this year, we are going through a period when that is being challenged. And I'm not a historian, but I think it's very important to appreciate you're in one of those inflection points in history, because you don't want to go another 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years and look back and say that was the moment when we should have acted. Because, as Lenin said once, there are decades when nothing seems to happen, and there are then weeks when decades seem to happen. History is non-linear. There are moments you have to grasp if you want to contribute to defining the future. And I think we are at one of those moments now. And science has an absolutely critical role, as does culture, and I might argue from another part of my life, so does sport, and I'll explain that at the end. But things that bring us together are absolutely critical. And if we are passive, and this is the responsibility of privilege, if we are passive in that inflection moment, then events of the rest of the century may take a course that we may or may not agree with. And so therefore engaging in that process I think is critical. The second, and I've felt this throughout certainly the latter part of 24 and for 2025, all of us, particularly in my world of the global health community, are going through a period of what almost feels, and I don't want to equate it with death, but it almost feels as if we've lost something, as if there's grief. And I think, and through 2025, I have felt that the consensus around global health, the fact that all countries need to contribute to global development, that we need to do that in a sustainable way, that actually humanity will be defined not by the privileged few, but by everybody, that we've taken away that to some degree, and we need to redefine that. Personally, I have not been able to think through creative solutions to the challenges of our time when in a sense of depression and pessimism. So part of our responsibility, I think, is to get over our grief and work through it and come out the other side. And scientists, and I include myself in this, are brilliant at describing issues, but not necessarily always good about acting on them. And I think we have to work through our stages of grief and then think creatively about the world that we want 21st century to be defined by. Because in the global health arena, and I think more broadly in science and indeed in societies generally, we are not going back to the past. We are going to a new world, and that new world still needs to be defined. And we can either, as I said, leave it passively for others to define it, or we can contribute to that discussion. And if you look at the great challenges of the 21st century, I think they are, in some ways, materially different to those we faced in the past, and they are, indeed, to a degree, existential. Climate change, biodiversity loss. One of the great underestimated trends, I think, of the 21st century is demographic shifts. These will have profound implications of the way that the 21st century pans out. Inequality. Inequality amongst our own citizens within our own countries, and then inequality between countries. If we allow inequality to grow further within our own countries or between our countries, then I think we are heading towards even greater conflict in the 21st century than we had in the 20th century, and that's a remarkable thing to say. We also need to accept that if we don't find a mechanism for sustainable economic growth, we will not be able to provide for the human population on the earth. And those two words are critical. We do need economic growth in order to provide for the future, but it has to be in a more sustainable way, and I don't think we have worked that out. And in that time of great challenges, and I think some of those are truly existential to humanity, to be slightly melodramatic, I think we also are in the midst of a cultural and scientific golden age. If I said to my younger, as in the photograph, person of a few years ago, in this decade, we would have vaccines for malaria, for tuberculosis, I would have been amazed. If you had said to me that you will face a global pandemic starting in December of 2019 and panning out, but by the end of December 2020, you would have a vaccine which would change the course of that pandemic, albeit that we did not make it then equitably accessible to everybody, and that's a very important point. I would have been amazed. There's current technological advances, whether in AI or quantum computing, or in all parts of the life sciences and indeed social and behavioral sciences, it is absolutely extraordinary. And so we face these enormous challenges in the 21st century, the like of which, of course, humanity has always faced challenges, but are, I think, at a different level of magnitude. And yet, at the same time, we have a scientific golden age. And our challenge of the moment, going back to the inflection point, is having accepted a scientific consensus for many decades, we are now in danger of a divergence of the scientific community from the very citizens that they serve and are part of, and from the diplomatic and political elite that makes policy decisions. If we allow that divergence to get larger, then I believe we will have imposed on the technological and scientific advances policy options which may not be best suited to maximizing the benefits of that scientific endeavor. And it goes back to the scientific advice into governments from Lithuania that I think we've already heard about. JESDA was set up, and I was part of setting up a JESDA, and somebody will have to remind me what JESDA stands for, but it's essentially trying to ensure that we anticipate where science is going, and that we make sure we don't just leave it to the scientific community, but citizens are involved in that, and critically as well, policymakers and diplomats are involved in it. Even as a scientist at the moment, with this pace of change, it's extraordinarily difficult to keep up with your own field, let alone with fields at the interfaces of you. Imagine what it's like if you are not even trained in the scientific methodology of what you would allow that to happen. And so therefore, if we allow the divergence of our citizens from the scientific community, and if we allow the divergence of the policymakers and the diplomats who actually ultimately make the choices at regional and global levels, then I fear that we will react to change, I would argue a little bit as we are doing to AI now, and we are in danger of doing to quantum computing, rather than anticipating that progress and thinking forward, what are the ethical, cultural, scientific, societal implications of this change, and how can we prepare and anticipate that development in order that we put around it the best framework and governance that and equity that allows it to be to the benefit of the maximum number of people. And that's also why these conferences such as this are so important. Because if we allow that divergence to go on further, then I believe that we will run into bigger problems in future. And there is a danger as well that, in the comments from Cardinal Tuxen just now, if we allow science to be done by a smaller number of people, for a small number of people, in a smaller number of countries, driven by the ability to pay for it, then we will leave out large sections of society, of humanity, and then we will not build equity. And actually, if we're not careful, science will drive greater inequity rather than greater equity. And finally, in this part, if you have not read, and I wouldn't normally read extensively, the Nobel Prize in Economics, but if you have not looked at the Nobel Prize in Economics from 2024, I would strongly encourage you to at least read the summary of the work that led into it. And it is controversial, the coming together of economists and historians, which is an odd bedfellows to bring together. But the hypothesis, the theory, is the question, basic question as I understand it as a life science scientist. Do you establish inclusive and evolving dynamic institutions, and does that drive development? Or do you develop and then establish your institutions? And it's a very important question. The answer that they provide, for which they won the Nobel Prize, is that actually it's institutions that drive progress. And at the moment, we are in another period of disruption when our very institutions are being questioned and challenged. Those institutions could be in the public sector, they could be in the private sector, they could be in philanthropy. They could be within the government sector. And I worry that if we allow the institutions to continue to drift, and the challenge in some places, in many, is justified. Institutions have moved away from addressing the issues of their citizens day to day. They have lost a degree of governance and transparency and inclusivity. And I think they have, and to not all, and I'm not talking about any one particular in particular, but if institutions do not evolve, if they are not inclusive, if they do not change as times change, then they will increasingly ossify. And if our institutions ossify, then they will be challenged, as they are doing at the moment. But ultimately, if you don't have institutions, then I think the danger of fragmentation and politicalization of systems will grow ever larger. And in those institutions, they can be national, they can be regional, but crucially, and coming from the World Health Organization for the last 2 years, I think there is a role for multilateral organizations and institutions. And multilateralism is under threat and under challenge at the moment, as it should be. Multilateralism is not a given, it's not a religion, it has to justify its very existence, and challenge should not be seen as something which is, it is critical, and so it should be. But we shouldn't hide away from challenge. And multilateralism needs to defend itself, and it needs to appreciate that if it has, again, as I said on other institutions, moved away from the very citizens it's supposed to serve and is seen as a global elite, then why should it expect the societies to support it? I happen to think, and I say this from inside the organization, but this is a personal view, I think the demise of multilateralism has been to a degree exaggerated. And there is a danger that if we allow that vicious cycle of criticism of those multilateral institutions, they will by default become dysfunctional. I would point to two things that have happened in the last 6 or 7 months, which allows me to think that multilateralism still has a purpose in a very fragmented world. Firstly, the Pandemic Accord, which some of you may have heard it's trying to establish that the sharing of data and samples in a pandemic and the sharing of benefits are put forward as a global enterprise, which everybody agrees with. It's amazed me in May of 2025 that all of the countries of the world that are part of the WHO, World Health Organization, i.e. 194 as we speak, maybe 193 in January, came together and agreed on that Pandemic Accord. There are details still to be worked out, and I'm not naive to think those are actually a huge challenge to work out, but nevertheless, 194 countries came together and agreed on that Pandemic Accord, with very tense discussions about intellectual property, about sample sharing, about benefit sharing in the time of a pandemic. And secondly, just actually this week at the United Nations, and again, I apologize, these are both from the Global Health Agenda, non-communicable diseases and mental health is a vexed area that separates and polarizes debates at the nation state, remarkably so. And again, 172 countries came together and approved that United Nations resolution on non-communicable diseases and mental health in a time of fragmentation. 2 voted against and 1 abstained. Without calling out those 3 countries in any particular, you can probably guess who they were, but the fact that 172, I think, don't quote me, it might be 177, came together and agreed on it is, I think, an example where multilateralism still works. So what should we do about this? Well, firstly, I go back to my starting point. Tough as it is, I think we have to accept that we have been disrupted. We may be in fear of losing something. We have to get over that. We have to lean in to the challenges of our time, because otherwise others will, and we may not be happy with the results. Secondly, the future is being defined now. In multilateralism, in connection with citizens, about equity, about climate change, about biodiversity, demographics. The future is being defined now, what we want from our institutions. It is the responsibility of privilege to not be passive in that. And I'll come back at the end of my talk to say more on that. Thirdly, we have to rebuild our institutions, not because they're ossifying, not because they have a faith or an evangelical sense behind them, but simply because I do believe the power of well-governed institutions which evolve and are dynamic but are connected with the citizens they serve at national, regional and global level are absolutely critical to progress, because the alternative to that is the rich will dominate everything. Fourthly, reconnect those institutions with the daily lives of citizens. Too often, I think, in elite organizations, which I am part of, and I'm part of a global elite, as everybody in this room has, we have occasionally been guilty of talking too much in the abstract to something that will happen 10, 20, or 30 years or 40 years from now and is critical to address, but seems disconnected from the challenges of people's lives today. And so I think our institutions have to reconnect with the daily lives of our citizens, and we would be advised to under-promise and over-deliver. That is difficult when in any political system you're incentivized to over-promise and under-deliver. But we should do the opposite. Fifthly, we should find ways that connect. I believe science is one of the greatest connectors, but so is culture, and so is sport. Find ways that you can agree on things whilst disagreeing on other things. And it's obviously well documented that during the height of the Cold War, Russia and the United States worked very closely on smallpox. If you cannot agree on 100 things, but you can agree on 10, focus on the 10 now, and then come back to the 20 that are challenging, and then come back to the 30, and lo and behold, you might get out of the 100 to 90 that you actually agree on. So in a fragmented, fractured, conflict-ridden world, let us find mechanisms and avenues where we can bridge, and I think science is an absolutely critical component of that. Do the small things well. Governing is really dull. It's about whether the lights are on. It's not dull whether the hospitals work or the primary care works or the education systems works, but that's what actually matters to people. So focus on the dull bits of governing and governance and do the small things well that actually make a difference. Do not take the scientific methodology for granted. If I talk to my brothers and sisters, they're not really sure what a t-test is or a p-value is or whatever, and do they really care? But they are interested in what the scientific is going to do for them today, tomorrow, and their children in 10 and 20 years' time. So don't take the scientific method and the uncertainty that comes with it and have the humility to express uncertainty. I do believe the public appreciates that we do not know all the answers. And during COVID, one of the challenges was there was too much clarity when actually there was uncertainty. So have the humility to know what uncertainty is and trust the scientific methods and challenge them as well. Multilateralism, I think, is still a valid force, but it has to evolve and it has to change. And I think it has become too distanced from the very people that it was set up in the post-Second World War era essentially to serve. 2 more points, and then I'll stop. Do not give in to nihilism and pessimism. Because there is an argument being made around various countries that it is all a waste of time. There's a cynical attitude that science hasn't delivered, culture has not delivered, politics has not delivered. It hasn't delivered for you or you. And we should accept that actually it hasn't. But don't give in to the fact that it won't. Because, again, I go back to my comment about grief. I cannot be creative about potential and possible solutions in the future if I'm in the middle of grief, nihilism, and pessimism. That is not stupid optimism. But we have to offer hope. We have to offer through culture, through science, and yes, through sport, that actually the future can be better. Because if we do not offer that, then there will be others who offer simple solutions to complex problems and may well be appealing, but actually are not selling a reality. So not blind optimism, but at least a sense of hope. And if we lose that sense of hope, as Barack Obama once said, then others will fill that space with cynicism and a vicious cycle of a downward cycle. And then finally, and this is a very strong personal view, it is a privilege to be in this room. It's a privilege to give a talk. It's a privilege to be introduced so generously. It's a privilege to sit in whichever row you're in. Along with that privilege comes a responsibility. And the responsibility is not to leave this room having agreed unanimously with the warm words, but the responsibility that comes with the privilege of sitting here is when you leave, that we all do what we can within the authority, power, and access we have to make a difference. Because if we do not, and we just go back to the warm words, but don't leave this room with the responsibility of change and leaning into the system and think it's up to somebody else, then I'm afraid we're being the passive that I started this conversation with. So although it doesn't feel it, that you, me, or anybody else in this room now, or online, or wherever they are, has power and agency, the reality is, compared to the vast majority of people in this world, everybody in this room does. And the responsibility of that is to not hide behind warm words, PowerPoint presentations. The responsibility is to say, that's what I'm going to do in the next 12 months to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Sir Jeremy Farrar. I think there is something to think about. I think you gave us hope, but you also gave us a responsibility that we have to answer to.